The year was 1936, and in a building on West Street in Lower Manhattan, a man named Mervin Kelly was staring at the future and seeing a graveyard. Kelly had just been promoted to Director of Research at Bell Telephone Laboratories. He was 42 years old. He had spent the past decade of his life perfecting vacuum tubes, the glass amplifiers that boosted telephone signals across the American continent. Under his direction, Bell Labs had pushed the lifespan of a single vacuum tube from 1,000 hours to 80,000 hours. It was an astonishing achievement. And Kelly knew, with a certainty that kept him awake at night, that it was not enough. The problem was not that vacuum tubes were bad. The problem was that vacuum tubes were glass. They were fragile. They were enormous, some the size of a man's forearm. They ran blazing hot, consuming enormous amounts of power just to function, radiating heat that degraded their own components from the inside. Every telephone switching station in the Bell system relied on thousands of these tubes and tens of thousands of electromechanical relay switches, clacking and humming in vast rooms that required constant air conditioning and constant maintenance. A single switching center in a major American city might contain tens of thousands of vacuum tubes, each one glowing orange like a tiny furnace, each one ticking down toward the moment it would fail. When a tube burned out, and they always burned out, a technician had to find it among thousands of identical glass cylinders arrayed in racks that stretched from floor to ceiling. He would walk the rows with a tube tester in his hand, checking each one, searching for the dead bulb among the living. Then he would pull it from its socket, hot enough to blister skin, plug in a replacement, and move on to the next failure. In a large switching station, tubes were failing every few hours. The system was designed to tolerate individual failures, but the rate of failure was accelerating as the network grew. It was like trying to keep a building standing while the bricks were constantly crumbling and had to be replaced one by one without ever closing the building. It worked, but it was held together by glass and heat and the constant labor of men who spent their careers replacing things that broke. Kelly understood something that most of his colleagues did not yet see. The telephone network was growing. The number of calls was increasing every year. The complexity of the switching required to connect those calls was growing exponentially. AT&T's own projections showed that if the system continued to rely on vacuum tubes and electromechanical switches, it would eventually require more tubes than could be manufactured, more power than could be generated, more technicians than could be hired, and more real estate than existed in the cities where the switching stations needed to be built. The vacuum tube had built the modern telephone system, and the vacuum tube was going to destroy it. So Kelly made a decision that would change the world. He began hiring physicists, not electrical engineers, not tube specialists, physicists. Young men with fresh doctorates from the best universities in the country, men who understood quantum mechanics and solid-state physics and the strange behavior of electrons inside crystalline materials. Kelly was not looking for people who could build a better vacuum tube. He was looking for people who could replace the vacuum tube entirely with something that did not require a vacuum, did not require glass, did not require heat, and did not burn out. He was looking for a solid-state amplifier, a device made from a solid chunk of material that could do everything a vacuum tube could do, but smaller, cooler, more reliable, and cheaper. In 1936, such a device did not exist. The physics to describe how one might work was still incomplete. The materials that might make it possible were still impure and poorly understood. Kelly was hiring scientists to solve a problem that the scientific community was not yet sure could be solved. Among his first recruits was a 26-year-old physicist from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology named William Bradford Shockley. William Shockley was brilliant. This is not a matter of opinion, it is a matter of record. He had graduated from Caltech, earned his doctorate at MIT, and arrived at Bell Labs in 1936 with a mind that moved faster than the people around him could follow. He was also arrogant, secretive, and possessed of a conviction that he was the smartest person in any room he entered. These qualities would eventually define him more than his science. But in 1936, they were merely footnotes to a dazzling intellect. Shockley's first attempt to build a solid-state amplifier came in 1939. He proposed a design based on the field effect, the idea that an external electric field applied to a piece of semiconductor material could change the material's conductivity, controlling the flow of current the way a valve controls the flow of water. He and an experimental physicist named Walter Brattain tried to build a prototype using copper oxide. It failed completely. The field had no measurable effect on the current. The semiconductor simply ignored the electric signal as if it were not there. Shockley could not explain why. The theory said it should work. The crystal said otherwise. Then the war came. Pearl Harbor pulled the scientists out of their laboratories and into military research. Bell Labs was devoted almost entirely to radar, sonar, gunfire control systems, and encrypted communications. Kelly himself was placed in charge of all military research at the labs, directing programs worth $175 million. The semiconductor work stopped, but the war years were not wasted. Military radar required crystal rectifiers, tiny devices made from silicon and germanium that could convert high-frequency radio signals into usable electrical currents. The mass production of millions of these rectifiers for radar sets forced an enormous advance in the understanding of semiconductor materials. Scientists learned how to purify germanium to levels of purity that had been unimaginable before the war. They learned how to control the electrical properties of crystals by introducing tiny amounts of impurities, a process called doping that turned out to be the key to everything that would follow. By 1945, when the war ended, scientists knew more about the behavior of electrons inside germanium and silicon crystals than they had ever known before. The war had killed millions. It had also accidentally prepared the ground for the most important invention in electronics history. Kelly saw the opportunity. In early 1945, he reorganized Bell Labs and created a new solid-state physics group. He put Shockley in charge. The group included Brattain, the experimentalist who had worked with Shockley before the war, and a new recruit, a theoretical physicist named John Bardeen. Bardeen was quiet, methodical, and possessed of a depth of understanding that complemented Shockley's aggressive brilliance. Where Shockley was a sprinter, Bardeen was a marathon runner. Where Shockley saw the destination and wanted to arrive immediately, Bardeen was interested in the terrain between here and there. The group also included chemists Stanley Morgan and Robert Gibney, electronics expert Hilbert Moore, and physicist Gerald Pearson. They met almost daily. They argued, they drew diagrams on blackboards and debated the mathematics of electron behavior. And they returned again and again to the same maddening question. Why didn't the field effect work? Why could an electric field not penetrate the surface of a semiconductor and control the current flowing through it? By March of 1946, Bardeen had the answer. It was a theoretical insight so elegant and so fundamental that it would eventually help earn him the first of 2 Nobel Prizes. Bardeen proposed that electrons were accumulating on the surface of the semiconductor, forming an invisible barrier, a kind of electrical shield that blocked the external field from penetrating into the bulk of the material. The field was not failing to affect the semiconductor, it was being stopped at the door by a layer of trapped electrons that no one had accounted for. This was the key, the surface states. If the surface electrons could be neutralized or bypassed, the field effect might work after all. What followed was one of the most intense periods of experimental physics in the 20th century. From November 17th to December 23, 1947, Bardeen and Brattain conducted a series of experiments in room 1E455 of Building 1 at Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey. It was a small room. The equipment was crude by modern standards, but the thinking was extraordinary. Brattain was the hands. He was a gifted experimentalist, a man who could build a circuit from scraps and coax a signal from a crystal with the patience of a watchmaker. Bardeen was the brain. He suggested experiments, interpreted the results, and revised the theory in real time as the data came in. In mid-November, Brattain stumbled onto a way to neutralize the surface states. By immersing the germanium in an electrolyte, he found he could override the blocking effect and allow the field to reach into the crystal. The surface barrier cracked open. Current began to flow in ways that the theory predicted. For the first time, the field effect produced measurable amplification. But the electrolyte was impractical for any real device. You cannot put a jar of liquid inside a telephone switching station. Bardeen and Brattain needed a way to achieve the same result without liquid, a dry contact that could neutralize the surface states and allow the field to reach into the crystal. They tried evaporating a thin film of gold onto the germanium surface, applying voltage through the gold. The results were promising but inconsistent. They tried different geometries, different pressures, different voltages. Each day brought a new experiment, a new failure, and a new insight. The lab notebooks from those weeks read like the diary of men who were closing in on something enormous and knew it. Then, on December 16, 1947, a Tuesday, Brattain tried something that looked almost absurd. He took a small plastic triangle, a wedge about the size of a pencil eraser, and wrapped it tightly with a thin ribbon of gold foil. Then he took a razor blade and carefully sliced the gold at the very tip of the wedge, creating two contacts separated by a gap of about 0.02 of an inch. He pressed the wedge gently against the surface of a slab of high-purity germanium. He connected the apparatus to a power supply and fed a signal into one of the gold contacts. The signal that came out of the other contact was larger, not slightly larger, 18 times larger. It was an amplifier, a solid-state amplifier, a device made from a chunk of crystal and a scrap of gold foil that did what vacuum tubes had done for 40 years, but without the vacuum, without the glass, without the heat, and without the inevitable failure. That evening, Bardeen went home to his wife, Jane, who was peeling carrots in the kitchen. He mentioned, casually, that he and Brattain had discovered something important at work that day. Jane said that was great and continued peeling carrots. Some time later, she found out that the something was the transistor. 1 week later, on December 23rd, Bardeen and Brattain demonstrated the device for Bell Labs executives. They spoke into a microphone connected to a circuit built around their crystal amplifier. The executives heard their voices come back amplified, clear, and undistorted. Shockley, who had supervised the group but had not been present for the breakthrough experiments, called it a magnificent Christmas present. But behind the celebration, something was already breaking.
William Shockley was furious. He had led the group. The field effect idea was his. The semiconductor research program existed because of his initiative, his ambition, his relentless push to prove that a solid-state amplifier was possible. And now, Bardeen and Brattain had built the device without him. They had done it on their own, in their own experiments while he was away, and their names would be on the patent, and his would not. Bell Labs patent attorneys had discovered that Shockley's field effect concept was too close to a 1925 patent by Julius Edgar Lilienfeld, a German-American physicist who had filed the paperwork for a field effects transistor decades earlier. Although Lilienfeld had never built a working device, his patent was broad enough that Shockley's claims could not stand. The point-contact transistor was Bardeen and Brattain's invention. Legally, intellectually, and historically, it belonged to them. Shockley confronted his colleagues. He told them, separately, that sometimes the people who do the work do not get the credit for it. It was a threat disguised as a philosophical observation. Bardeen, ever direct, replied that there was enough glory in this for everybody. But Shockley did not want shared glory. He wanted sole glory. He wanted history to remember him, and only him, as the man who replaced the vacuum tube. Shockley's reaction was swift and calculated. He withdrew from the group. He stopped attending meetings. He went home and worked alone, in secret, at his kitchen table and in his study, driven by a need that was not purely scientific. It was personal. It was the need to prove that he was not a supporting player in this story. He needed to be the inventor. Within weeks, Shockley conceived a fundamentally different design. Instead of jabbing delicate metal points into the surface of a crystal, his transistor would consist of 3 layers of semiconductor material sandwiched together, like layers of a cake. A thin middle layer, called the base, would control the current flowing between the outer 2 layers. It was a junction transistor. It was more robust, more reliable, and more manufacturable than the point contact design. By 1950, Bell Labs chemists Gordon Teal and Morgan Sparks had produced a working junction transistor, and Shockley's design would become the standard for the next 2 decades. But the damage was done. Shockley never forgave Bardeen and Brattain. He ordered that no photographs of the 2 men be taken without his presence. He inserted himself into every publicity opportunity, every press conference, every magazine article. Bell Labs management presented all 3 men as co-inventors, a polite fiction that concealed a bitter reality. Shockley blocked Bardeen and Brattain from further work on the transistor. Bardeen, disgusted, turned his attention to superconductivity and left Bell Labs in 1951 for the University of Illinois. Brattain refused to work with Shockley and was reassigned to another group. The 3 men who had shared the most important invention of the 20th century would never collaborate again. They met once more in 1956 to receive the Nobel Prize in Physics together. They smiled for the cameras, they shook hands, and then they went their separate ways forever. On June 30th, 1948, Bell Labs held a press conference at its headquarters in New York City to announce the transistor to the world. The name itself was new, coined just weeks earlier by Bell Labs electrical engineer John R. Pierce, a man who also wrote science fiction in his spare time. He combined the words transfer and resistor into transistor. It was a word that sounded technical without being intimidating, scientific without being obscure. It was the perfect name for a device that would need to be explained to a world that did not yet know it needed it. A spokesman at the press conference said the device might have far-reaching significance in electronics and electrical communication. The next day, the New York Times reported the story. It appeared on page 46 in a column called The News of Radio, below an item about a new soap opera sponsor. The most important invention of the century was introduced to America as a footnote beneath an advertisement for dish soap. The world did not understand what had happened. This is not surprising. The transistor was tiny, ugly, and incomprehensible to anyone without a physics degree. It did not look like the future. It looked like a small metal cylinder with 3 wires sticking out of it. It had no glow, no warmth, no visible sign that it was doing anything at all. A vacuum tube, for all its flaws, at least looked alive. It glowed orange. It hummed. You could feel it working. The transistor was silent, cool, and indifferent. It was, as one engineer later described it, a 50th the size of the vacuum tube it was designed to replace. It used a fraction of the power. It generated almost no heat. It did not burn out, and it could switch on and off at speeds that no vacuum tube could match. But it took years for the implications to become visible. The first commercial product to use a transistor was a hearing aid, the Sono 1010, released in 1952, a device so small that it could be worn discreetly, a liberation for millions of people who had been forced to carry bulky vacuum tube hearing aids the size of a deck of cards. It was followed in 1954 by the Regency TR-1, the first transistor radio, which sold for $49.95 and could fit in a shirt pocket. In 1955, Sony began selling transistor radios in the United States for $29.95, capturing a market that would help transform a war-devastated Japanese electronics industry into a global powerhouse. A country that had been firebombed into rubble 10 years earlier was now selling Americans the future in a box the size of a sandwich. In 1954, Bell Labs built TRADAC, the first fully transistorized computer, using 800 transistors instead of vacuum tubes. It was smaller, faster, cooler, and more reliable than any tube-based computer in existence. IBM noticed, the military noticed, the world noticed. The age of the vacuum tube was ending. The transistor did not just replace the vacuum tube, it made possible things that the vacuum tube could never have done. A vacuum tube computer that could perform the calculations of a modern smartphone would have filled an entire city block, required its own power plant, and employed a full-time staff just to replace the tubes that burned out every few minutes. The first electronic computer, ENIAC, built in 1945, used 17,000 vacuum tubes and consumed 150 kilowatts of power. It broke down so frequently that it was operational less than half the time. The transistor changed all of that. It made the computer personal. It made the satellite possible. It made the mobile phone conceivable. It made the internet inevitable. Every digital device you have ever touched, every screen you have ever read, every call you have ever made, every photograph you have ever taken with your phone exists because two men in a small room in New Jersey pressed a plastic wedge wrapped in gold foil against a piece of germanium and watched a signal grow 18 times stronger.
But the transistor story does not end in Murray Hill. It ends, improbably, in a fruit packing shed in Mountain View, California. In 1956, William Shockley left Bell Labs. He was 56 years old, a Nobel laureate, and consumed by a desire to profit from the revolution he believed he had created. He founded the Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory in a converted shed near Palo Alto, backed by $1 million from Arnold Beckman of Beckman Instruments. He recruited the most brilliant young physicists and engineers he could find, luring them from universities and established laboratories with the promise of working with a Nobel Prize winner at the frontier of semiconductor technology. Among them were Robert Noyce from Philto, Gordon Moore from Johns Hopkins, and 6 other exceptional young scientists. The brilliance of the recruits was matched only by the toxicity of their boss. Shockley was a tyrant. He micromanaged every experiment. He demanded to see every lab notebook. He threatened lie detector tests when he suspected disloyalty. He abandoned the silicon transistor research that his recruits wanted to pursue and insisted on developing a 4-layer diode that had no commercial future. He treated his employees not as colleagues, but as subordinates to be disciplined. By the summer of 1957, 8 of Shockley's best scientists had had enough. They asked Arnold Beckman to replace Shockley as manager. Beckman refused. On September 18, 1957, the 8 men resigned together. Shockley called them traitors. The name stuck. They became known as the Traitorous 8. The Traitorous 8 found a backer in Sherman Fairchild, a wealthy New York entrepreneur and playboy who had inherited an IBM fortune and who invested $1.5 million in their new company. They called it Fairchild Semiconductor. They set up operations in Mountain View, California, 12 blocks from Shockley's laboratory, and went to work building the silicon transistors that Shockley had refused to let them build. Their timing was extraordinary. 1 month after they founded Fairchild, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. The space race began. The military's demand for small, reliable, lightweight electronic components exploded overnight. Within a year, Fairchild Semiconductor was producing transistors that were being evaluated for the Minuteman missile guidance computer. Within 5 years, the company had become one of the most important semiconductor firms in the world. But Fairchild had its own fatal flaw. The company was owned by its East Coast parent, Fairchild Camera and Instrument, which had the right to buy out the founders' shares at a fixed price of $3 million. As the company grew more valuable, the founders realized they were building an empire they would never own. The resentment built, and the culture of leaving, which Shockley had inadvertently created by being so terrible that his best people walked out, became the founding principle of Silicon Valley. You did not stay, you left. You took what you learned, and you started something new.
And so the traitorous eight scattered again. Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore left Fairchild in 1968 to found a new company. They called it Intel. Eugene Kleiner co-founded the venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins. Don Valentine, a Fairchild alumnus, founded Sequoia Capital. Jerry Sanders founded Advanced Micro Devices. Over the next 2 decades, Fairchild Semiconductor spawned more than 100 spin-off companies. The orchards and quiet suburbs of Northern California were paved over and replaced by office parks and laboratories and the strange, relentless energy of an industry that was inventing itself as it went. They called the region Silicon Valley. The silicon came from Shockley. The valley came from the men who betrayed him. And the transistor that started it all came from 2 quiet physicists in a small room in New Jersey who pressed a piece of gold against a crystal on a Tuesday afternoon in December and watched the signal grow.
Here is the final irony. John Bardeen, the theoretical physicist who cracked the surface state problem and made the transistor possible, left Bell Labs in 1951 and went to the University of Illinois. There, he developed a theory of superconductivity so fundamental and so elegant that it earned him a second Nobel Prize in Physics in 1972. He remains the only person in history to have won the Nobel Prize in Physics twice. He died in 1991 at age 82, a quiet man who had changed the world twice and never sought the spotlight. Walter Brattain, the experimentalist who built the first transistor with his own hands, stayed at Bell Labs until 1967, working on the surface properties of semiconductors. He retired to become a professor at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. He died in 1987 at age 85. William Shockley became a professor at Stanford. His semiconductor company never turned a profit. It was sold in 1960 and quickly forgotten. In his later years, Shockley turned to eugenics, promoting theories of racial genetic superiority that made him a pariah in the scientific community, severed his remaining professional friendships, and destroyed the last traces of the reputation he had spent a lifetime building. The man who had co-invented the transistor, who had designed the junction transistor that powered the first generation of computers, who had brought silicon to Silicon Valley, spent his final decades arguing that intelligence was determined by race and that certain populations should be discouraged from reproducing. He was picketed at his own lectures. His colleagues refused to speak to him. His name, once synonymous with genius, became synonymous with something much darker. He died in 1989 at the age of 79, alone and estranged from his family. His children learned of his death from the newspaper. None of them attended the funeral. The transistor they created together and then tore themselves apart over is now the most manufactured object in human history. There are more transistors on Earth than there are leaves on every tree, grains of sand on every beach, stars in every galaxy visible to the naked eye. A modern microprocessor contains billions of them, each one smaller than a virus, switching on and off billions of times per second, performing the calculations that power your phone, your car, your bank, your hospital, your government, your memory, your life. It all started with a problem. The vacuum tube was going to kill the telephone network, and a quiet research director in Manhattan hired some physicists, and one of those physicists proposed a theory about electrons trapped on a crystal surface, and another physicist pressed a plastic wedge wrapped in gold foil against a piece of germanium in a small room in New Jersey at 12:45 on a Tuesday afternoon in December 1947. The signal went in weak. It came out strong. Everything after that, every computer, every satellite, every smartphone, every streaming video, every text message, every GPS coordinate, every artificial intelligence, every neural network trained on every word ever written, all of it traces back to that moment, to that room, to that crystal, to a signal that went in dying and came out alive. The vacuum tube glowed for 50 years.
The transistor has been running for 78. It shows no signs of stopping. And the men who built it, who loved and hated each other in equal measure, who shared a Nobel Prize and then never spoke again, they are gone now. All three of them. But the crystal remembers. The signal is still growing.